You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Coming up, we'll look at a bill in the Florida Senate that could assign financial liability to someone who harms an unborn child, including an abortion provider. And later, we'll head down to Lakeland, where Jim McFarland is running a fourth-generation shoe repair shop using some 21st century marketing methods. First, as of 3 this afternoon on Thursday, April 10th, most of President Trump's steepest tariffs are on hold. Hours after they went into effect yesterday, the president announced a 90-day pause. He is keeping a recently implemented 10% tariff on dozens of countries, impacting most global imports to the U.S., and the president is hiking the tax rate on imports from China to at least 145%. The Trump tariff turbulence is not resolved. Once the pause was announced, stocks surged yesterday after days of market meltdowns. Then they slid again this morning. Now, we can watch how Wall Street reacts in real time to these on-again, off-again tariffs. When it comes to Main Street, the uncertainty is impacting Central Florida businesses in ways you may not realize. We visited two on Tuesday, hours before the big tariff hikes were set to go into effect. We didn't have to go far to find a business whose success is reliant on imported goods. Cedar Halal Food and Grill is about a quarter mile from our studios on East Colonial Drive. Haidar Aman is the owner of the strip mall market and lunch counter. He asked us to call him Eddie, and he takes pride in offering quality Middle Eastern fare at affordable prices. And that's how he's been able to maintain a steady and loyal customer base for more than 20 years.
My own customer as American supporter, Spanish supporter, and Indian, Pakistani, and most all like a friend for me right now.
I stopped by Cedar Halal on Tuesday after that lunch rush died down. As I walked through his store, the smells were amazing. It was a mashup of Middle Eastern spices and a woody floral incense. Glass display cases showcased large trays of creamy hummus, paprika-infused baba ganoush, and flaky triangles of baklava shimmering under that honey glaze. Marinated lamb and chicken sizzled on the flat top. The market includes shelves of imported foods from across the Middle East.
We have the baba beans like they call fool, the labneh in the cooler, feta cheese, Greek cheese, Bulgarian cheese, Arabic cheese, like also two kind of like pastrma, and those like customers, they don't find it anywhere, only in the special Middle Eastern place.
With the exception of the fresh meat and produce in his grill, Eddie says 99% of his stock is imported from the Middle East, and all of it is subject to tariffs. When I spoke with him earlier this week, the tariffs were still in place, and Eddie's mind was on his next inventory order.
The prices already every week is going up and up, so we cannot even keep going and changing the price every couple of weeks. We gotta order every week. Gotta order from different wholesaler company, but their price different, and every week is going up and up.
Eddie is already seeing the wholesalers he buys from on a daily basis reacting to the market volatility experienced from Wall Street in New York to East Colonial Drive in Orlando.
Today I just went to the market. Actually, everybody knows Restaurant Depot. The price is crazy. The chicken per pound went up more than like $2 for the past months. We used to buy the boneless thigh $1.69. Today it's $3.33. I mean, it's crazy. So the boxes like cost us $40, $50 more, and that we use a lot every day. So we're gonna raise the price very soon if the price is still like that.
And raising prices is the very last thing Eddie wants to do. They're what keeps his customers coming back to the grill. But Eddie doesn't think he has long before he'll be forced to increase menu rates.
Maybe another month or so, and I have to change the price because I still selling my shawarma sandwich for $8.99. Everywhere else in East Orlando or West Orlando, $12, $13, $14 a sandwich. But the only thing it's helping me because I've been in this business and this location for 20 years.
And as for his customers,
They're complaining, everything going up, everything going up. The price is high, the price is high. But it's not only here because they're shopping around Publix, Walmart, they see the price different too.
that's Haidar Eddie Ahmad, owner of Cedar Halal Food and Grill. American consumers can breathe a brief sigh of relief as tariffs were suspended for more than 75 countries. One business that isn't too worried about the tariffs is Hyrule Kingdom Video Games, an independent game shop. Jose Rivera is the owner. He opened the store a year ago this week. He has another game store in Port Orange that's been running for 20 years. He'll soon open a third location in the Miami area. I stopped by Hyrule Kingdom earlier this week to talk with Jose about how his import-reliant business is faring. He was in the process of renovating the shop, but the shelves were packed with video game cartridges from all eras. Old Atari games from the 70s through the newest Nintendo and PlayStation titles, they all lined the walls. A very friendly, yet low-energy, yellow mixed dog greeted me at the door. Jose's take on the tariffs is a little different than Eddie's. He explains why he isn't as concerned.
When it comes to games, it's the cheapest form of entertainment you can get.
Despite the fact that nearly all gaming consoles and games are manufactured in China, Mexico, or Vietnam, Jose has something of a formula worked out that explains why economic downturns like this don't affect his business.
$80 takes you 100 hours of video game play at home, a few dollars of electricity, compared to going to the movies, even just buying 2 tickets is $35 only for 2 hours. So if you compare it to a video game that lasts 100 hours, you're saving technically like $1,000 just going out instead of just staying at home and relaxing. So personally, I don't think the tariffs are going to really bother people when it comes to games. Maybe gas and food and all other types of items, but games are just, they give people comfort.
Jose has seen video games serve as a social comforter before. He's very familiar with how the video game industry reacts to shifts in the global markets.
You know, in 2008, when the market crashed in the housing market, games shot up, became super popular. Pandemic kicked in, games shot up, everybody's staying home. So if anything, I would expect the exact same issue to occur now, where people are just gonna buy games and just stay home because everything is just too expensive.
The retail video game industry is unique in that it relies on the sales of new inventory as much as the exchange of used games and equipment. With the exception of big box retailers, the model is used by international chains like GameStop and independent shops like Hyrule Kingdom. Some gamers like to save their gear for posterity. Others would rather recycle it towards the challenge of a new game or upgraded system. And it's that cycle of game exchange that Jose is expecting to boom.
I do anticipate, if the tariffs do stay in place, to get a massive flood of games being sold because people will have to adjust and accommodate. Like their paychecks are not going up. So they're going to have to sell to be able to get some extra money. It happens all the time, too.
Despite the uncertainty of where the economy may head in both the near future and throughout the rest of the year, Jose Rivera keeps a positive outlook, staying focused on his business.
Still on track to open my third business in Miami at the end of the year, even with tariffs and all. So I don't let it impact me. I just keep it moving.
Jose Rivera is the owner of Hyrule Kingdom Video Games. Few people are as reliant on investment income as retired seniors. And this being Central Florida, we're in no shortage of retirees, many of whom spent this week glued to 401k dashboards and investment apps. We spoke to Scott Perrone, a certified financial planner in Orlando, specializing in retirement preparation. Perrone said financial diversification is key. When it comes to the stock market, he's confident that there is stability in the long game. That doesn't mean he isn't concerned about this week's fluctuations and the threat of tariffs in the future.
The market is often looking 6 to 9 months out, and whatever you're seeing today is maybe a reflection of their expectations down the road. So with that being said, it's pretty clear the market is telling us they are very concerned about the impact of tariffs.
This isn't Perrone's first visit to this rodeo. Being a good advisor isn't so much about how well your clients do when the market is up. It's about the decisions made in the moments like these. From this perspective, Perone has faith that his clients trust him.
A lot of my clients have been through this before. They've experienced pullbacks and ups and downs. So we've seen all kinds of different climates from the political environment, recessions. So my advice to my clients, it's pretty consistent. I might sound like a broken record sometime, but rarely is it the right thing to do to panic and just bury it all in the backyard. I think that's even more important with this particular situation because we know the situation with tariffs could change pretty quickly and the markets could react pretty quickly too. So it's very important to stay invested in a time like this.
Again, Perone has faith in the market's long-term performance. He just emphasizes investing with the head, not the heart.
I do think it's very important to remove your emotions from investing. I think it's also equally important to understand that the market doesn't go up in a straight line. We always have these peaks and troughs along the way. In fact, I use an analogy. I compare investing in the stock market to walking up a hill while you're playing with a yo-yo. If you zoom in on the yo-yo, you're going to see it going up and down on a daily basis, and you're going to have all the emotions that come along with that up and down yo-yo. But if you zoom out and you look at the long-term perspective, you'll see that you're walking up a hill on your way to your financial goal.
Scott Perone is a financial and retirement planner based in Orlando. We want to hear your reactions regarding these tariffs and their impact on your finances. Are you a retiree reliant on investment savings? A consumer of imported goods? Are you a gamer with plans for a new purchase in the near future? How is this economic uncertainty affecting your life? You can email us at engage@cfpublic.org, or you can send us a talkback on the free Central Florida Public Media app. In the menu, select Send Us a Talkback, record your question or feedback, then hit send. There's more ahead here on Engage. Florida lawmakers moved a measure forward this week to extend personal injury laws to unborn fetuses and allow family members to sue for damages. We hear from healthcare providers about the impact and discuss what's behind the push to extend legal rights to unborn children. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. A push to define unborn children and give them legal protections is gaining traction in the state. The Florida House of Representatives passed the civil liability for the wrongful death of an unborn child bill yesterday, sending it to the Senate for consideration. Under this, survivors of the deceased and other family members could sue for pain and suffering and for potential future earnings lost. I spoke to Jay Wolfson, a professor of health law at Stetson University, about the potential impact to healthcare and women's rights. Wolfson told me this bill is a new application of the law, one that is opening the eyes of attorneys, clinicians, insurance companies, and families. He starts our conversation explaining what this bill does and how it's different from attempts to legally codify fetal personhood.
You've got a person being defined from the moment of conception. You've got that being incorporated into the definition of a person who is wrongfully killed in the Wrongful Death Act. And you've got the components of damages that are already part of the Wrongful Death Act now applying to fetuses from the moment of conception. So the challenges are, one, being able to determine that the fetus became inviable or died as a consequence of somebody's negligence. An extreme example might be if somebody became pregnant and they were in their office and their boss yelled at them or berated them, and 2 days later there was a miscarriage. Could that woman then reasonably claim that the stress and anxiety and meanness of the boss was an intentional act, it was negligent, he knew she was pregnant, and as a consequence of that, she miscarried? There are other examples where partners could be involved in physical acts or mental acts that could cause stress or physical damage, or even in a car accident. So at that point, you'd have to be able to make the correlation that somebody was in fact negligent, which means they had a duty, they breached that duty, there was an injury, and the injury was associated with the action. That's tough stuff to begin with, but that's what tort attorneys, injury attorneys do.
I feel like I could come up with thousands of different specific scenarios that are plausible that could be argued under this bill if it passes.
Yeah.
Let me follow up on a couple of them. One of the provisions calling for assessing the future earning potential of an unborn person to determine those damages that could be awarded. How do you do that how do you know what that unborn person was actually going to end up doing?
You don't. So this again is kind of on the frontiers of tort law and law in general, and to a degree on the frontiers of economics, because there are economists who specialize in doing these kinds of projections, and they'll argue in court. You'll get experts, but generally you take somebody who is 30 years old, they come from social economic background, they have a certain education, they currently have a certain job, their health is generally ranked good or fair or poor, and you take those factors, and there are some models that have been validated for taking that now person and saying, well, that person probably would have lived another 47 years and they could have become a this or a that, and we ascribe economic value to those things, and it works pretty well. When you don't have a foundation in terms of that person's life activities and what they've been doing, you take even a 2-year-old. How do you ascribe future value for that? Well, there are some economic models that have sought to do that, and they usually work in court consequent to settlement discussions. Here it's much more challenging, and I think it'll be interesting, should this bill become law, to see how the economists battle this out in court using empirical economic models and presumptions about the value of an unknown person in the future world. That's what it's going to have to require.
The bill explicitly says that wrongful death action is not authorized in the case of, quote, a healthcare provider for the death of an unborn child which results from lawful medical care provided in compliance with the applicable standard of care. What is standard of care? Who determines if that is being met?
Well, this is what happens in any medical malpractice case where there's an allegation that the standard of care was not met. And this is where you have the battle of the experts in court. And, depending on what the cause of death was and the circumstances of death, or the full scope of care and treatment, there are medical malpractice cases that bring in everybody who was involved in the care of that patient for years, saying that somebody should have somehow identified a risk factor. So this is where, in some respects, this could be a lawyer's relief act. For tort lawyers who are going to say, we're going to just attach everybody. And what happens in these malpractice cases more often than not is there are settlements because it's more expensive to litigate. And in Florida, physicians who have 3 dispositions against them, in other words, they've gone to court and they've lost the case, are subject to having their licenses suspended and revoked. So in many cases, there's a settlement, even if there was no basis for saying the person really was negligent. And there's a lot of concern about this because the standard of medical care is ostensibly based on the standards of that subspecialty, whether it's a pediatrician or an obstetrician or a neurologist who's involved in the care. And if something happened during the course of the pregnancy that involved a clinician, and the family felt that but for a failure to completely and adequately care for the patient, applying the best standard of medical care, the baby would not have been lost, that's going to be litigated. And the way that we work those litigations in Florida is they are contingency cases. So if attorneys feel that they've got a strong enough basis for making the allegation and of publicizing it, then insurance companies sometimes elect to settle cases rather than fight them because of the cost. Now, that's not to say that there's going to be a rush to the bar and to the bench to litigate, but it opens the door because of the ambiguities, and those ambiguities are going to be solved through litigation.
Can you explain what protections for the mother are in place in this legislation?
The mother cannot be held liable for the death of the fetus. However, if the mother intentionally causes the death of the fetus, then she could be held liable for wrongful death. And that raises the question after 6 weeks, up to 6 weeks in Florida, abortions are still legal under certain circumstances. And even after 6 weeks, under certain circumstances, they can be provided. But the ambiguities remain.
Jay Wolfson is a professor of health law at Stetson University and senior associate vice president of USF Health. We heard him explain that the bill would protect mothers from wrongful action and healthcare providers in certain circumstances, as long as that provider is in compliance with standards of care. But some healthcare providers and doctors are alarmed by the consequences of this measure. Laura Goodhue is executive director of the Florida Alliance of Planned Parenthood Affiliates, and Dr. Chelsea Daniels is a staff member at Planned Parenthood. They joined Engage to talk about their concerns for patients seeking care and legal complications that could arise. Dr. Daniels started our conversation with an anecdote that illustrates the gray area she sees in this bill.
I had this patient situation last week that was so disturbing, and I'm imagining her having to navigate the implications of this bill. She came in and she was wearing those kinds of glasses that you get after you go to the eye doctor when you've had your eyes dilated. And I asked her, I said, naively, I said, "Oh, did you just get your eyes dilated?" And then she took off her glasses and she goes, "No, I was assaulted." And her left eye was swollen out to here, and the whites of it were just bright red, and her ex had come to her home, assaulted her, raped her, and now she was pregnant and seeking an abortion. And it was awful in just about all the ways you can imagine. And I just think about someone like her caught in the crosshairs of a bill like this, because this is exactly the kind of people who wouldn't have the resources to fight this legislation, and who would be forced to be in these ultimately dangerous situations. I mean, women are more likely to die at the hands of a partner or ex-partner during pregnancy than anything else. And I mean, this ultimately just puts women's lives in danger.
Dr. Daniels, what are you saying to patients in these circumstances? And perhaps the better question is, what are you authorized to say?
So luckily, she was below 6 weeks. So in the state of Florida, we were still able to provide her with care. But I think about the situation where she was above 6 weeks and she would have to subsequently jump through the necessary legal hoops the state requires in order to meet the exceptions that the legislation requires. So that would be the form of a police report or a restraining order. And she was clear. She's like, I want nothing to do with him. I'm going to leave this state. I don't want to file anything. So God forbid, had she been 6 weeks and 1 day and she had wanted an abortion in the state of Florida without that paperwork, she wouldn't have been able to obtain care. And I see a lot of patients who are in that exact situation with really angry partners, abusive partners. I saw a different patient the other day, could go on and on. She came in with a baby, a 1-year-old in her stroller. She was coming in to sign consents with me to go out of state to North Carolina. So she was above 6 weeks. She was wearing a tank top and she had bruises all over her arm. And I asked her about her bruises. And she told me that the father of her 1-year-old and the father of the current pregnancy she lived with was beating her up, but she had nowhere else to go. And she didn't want to file anything for the safety of her baby. So I'm seeing this every single day and having these conversations with women every single day. And the law just absolutely does not take any of that into account.
Follow up for you on the intent of this law. To my knowledge, it doesn't explicitly state the purpose is to restrict abortion access. Can you just talk about the impact of defining an unborn child? Does it mean that Florida law would define life beginning at conception? Is this something you see in other states, just as an advocate?
It is something we've seen in other states, and specifically this law defines unborn child as any stage of development. So this could be from conception. And so someone could not know they're pregnant. And we know, many pregnancies end in miscarriage. So say someone miscarries and, they're grieving, obviously, and, something happens, like they fall in a grocery store, or a doctor gives them a medication, that they think might have ended the pregnancy. You're really setting this up for lawsuits that are unnecessary. And, from the legislature that has, constantly gone after frivolous lawsuits, this would be going backwards.
Dr. Daniels, I want to follow up there with you as a provider. Do you feel protected by the language?
Absolutely not. And I don't think it is the interest of legislation like this to make us feel protected. I think it's in the interest of legislation like this to make us feel scared, and ultimately scared to do our jobs and scared to do what's right for our patients. And the inevitable downstream consequences of this is increasing rates of maternal mortality, as we are already seeing all across the Southeast and other states with abortion. If it weren't so inhumane and cruel, it would almost be comical that these legislators have the audacity to think that language like this is protecting people, because it is doing the exact opposite. And it's in no way empowering doctors to make appropriate clinical decisions.
Can we talk about what this means for in vitro fertilization? Would this increase liabilities for IVF clinics?
So this is the thing. It's another step, right? So if you are treating embryos and fetuses the same as living children, it does set the stage for shutting down fertility treatments like IVF. Now, this bill in particular has language around, in the womb. However, we've seen this, the term unborn child that is used in this statute being placed in other places in statute. For example, there's another bill moving through that adds it to language around boating accidents. So there is a effort in a long-term strategy from opposition to continue to use this language in places like Alabama that, has established basically rights for embryos and fetuses, which sets up lots of problems, as you were mentioning. So does that mean that anyone who's pregnant can't be around secondhand smoke? Can they obtain cancer treatment if the pregnancy carries the same, rights as living children? And I think that that's the real problem here, is this is a slippery slope that is not necessary to go down by any means.
Dr. Daniels, have you encountered concerns from patients that you're working with that I haven't thought to ask you about? What are you hearing from them?
What I hear from my patients is that they're frustrated that a simple one-day abortion process has been spread into at least 2 days because of the mandatory 24-hour waiting period in Florida. What I hear from my patients is that they just found out they're pregnant, and now they're being told to leave the state when they don't have the resources to do so. What I hear from my patients is that they don't understand why they have to sign so many forms that are legal documents. So they're feeling the effects of this, and understandably so. And it's infuriating to me as a provider who's dedicated my career to this and has been in school and training for this for so long, to have to explain to my patients that so many things that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis are not actually clinically indicated. They're just it's the state breathing down my neck.
Dr. Daniels, what keeps you practicing in Florida? Why not relocate to Massachusetts, California?
Yeah, I mean, I moved to Florida in order to provide this care in a banned state because it's so important to do. I understand why doctors don't want to be here, why they're afraid to be here. But at the end of the day, there are still people here who can get pregnant and need our help. And I recognize that comes at sometimes a personal cost, but it feels right now important for me and for my community. Just the number of patients I see in a day, they need this care too. Just because they live in a state where their rights are being attacked daily doesn't mean that they don't deserve access to pregnancy care.
Laura Goodhue is Executive Director of the Florida Alliance of Planned Parenthood Affiliates. Dr. Chelsea Daniels is a staff member at Planned Parenthood. The bill we're discussing defines an unborn person as a member of the species Homo sapien in any stage of development who is carried in the womb. Matt Staver, founder and chairman of the Conservative Liberty Council in Orlando, says the civil liability for the wrongful death of an unborn child bill is an appropriate way of protecting children in Florida. He starts our conversation explaining his support for the bill.
This is an important bill because it recognizes the humanity of the unborn child. In fact, when I argued before the Florida Supreme Court with respect to the proposed Amendment 4, we placed before the Florida Supreme Court a long list of statutes that actually already recognize the humanity of the unborn child, and these include both in civil as well as criminal, including trust and estates and wills. So that's been a tradition in Florida, but not just Florida, in many other states around the country, to recognize the humanity of the unborn child. I think this is the next step in the correct direction.
Do you see this as a preventative measure or a punitive one?
I see this as a preventative measure. Certainly, I see it as a punitive one as well. It's preventative in the sense that people need to recognize if they're going to strike a mother who's carrying an unborn child or injure a mother with an unborn child, there are damages both criminally outside of this particular bill, but also civilly if you cause an injury to the unborn child. The trend in the nation has been for the last a number of years to recognize legal rights of the unborn child. The abortion decision of Roe versus Wade that was overturned in 2022 was literally on a shrinking island all by itself because the trajectory of the law in all these areas, in civil liability, criminal liability, in wills, trust, and estates, all recognize the humanity and legal rights of the unborn child. And that trend has continued to grow, and this is another example of that trend.
Do you believe that this sufficiently protects healthcare providers?
I think this protects healthcare providers that are practicing medicine and that they are doing medicine within the acceptable range of practice. The bill specifically addresses that with regards to healthcare providers. As long as they're in compliance with the applicable standards of care, that's fairly standard in any particular area. As long as a doctor is acting inconsistent with the applicable standard of care in any area, and this one puts it in the same category here, the doctors, healthcare providers are all protected. And the mother of the unborn child is also protected as well, is not held liable for the death of the unborn child. It really is looking at neither the mother nor the healthcare provider that practices within the applicable standard of care, but a third party, some other person or entity that injures the unborn child. That is the target of what needs to be held responsible and liable for civil damages under this particular bill.
We spoke to a healthcare provider who is concerned about there being too much of a gray area, that this bill could hold abortion providers financially responsible if it is determined their treatment violated that, quote, applicable standard of care that really isn't defined in the bill.
Well, an abortion provider could be held accountable if they're not practicing in compliance with the applicable standard of care, just like any other provider. You can't give total free rein to healthcare providers to do anything that they desire. They have to practice within the applicable standard of care, not only in this area, but in every area of medicine and healthcare provision. There needs to be a standard, and anyone who deviates from that standard can be sued for malpractice or other kinds of damages. That's been traditionally true in every area of healthcare provision, and that's the same here. As long as the healthcare provider is acting in compliance with the applicable standard of care, the healthcare provider is not responsible liability-wise for the death of the unborn child.
Matt Staver is the founder and chairman of the Liberty Council. We did reach out to Senator Aaron Grahl, sponsor of the Senate version of this bill. We received no response. Coming up, Jim McFarland grew up in his father's shoe repair shop, learning a trade he is passing on to his own children. We'll go to his fourth-generation shop to see how Lakelanders keep their shoes in tip-top shape. All of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org, and we want to talk about issues you want to discuss. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. In this day and age of disposable attire, few people think to get clothing and shoes repaired when they can be replaced on Amazon for just a couple bucks. Producer Richard Copeland traveled to Lakeland to meet a man who would rather repair a worn pair of shoes than lay out for new kicks.
Nestled in a strip mall in Lakeland, McFarland's Shoe Repair is serving a community that values repairing a good pair of shoes over replacing them. The business began more than 100 years ago in Indiana, and over the generations, the McFarlands found their way to Lakeland. I stopped by to meet Jim and check out the mid-20th century machinery he uses to fix the Oxfords, loafers, Jimmy Choos, and Christian Louboutins his customers bring in. Jim began our conversation by lamenting the flood of cheap shoes available to Americans, but noting there is still high-quality footwear out there.
People will say, oh, shoes are coming in, they're cheap, blah, blah, blah. Yes, there's a lot of that. Over 95% of the shoes in this country are imported from China. 95%. More than 95%. But there's still a lot of great shoes being made. There's some made here in the United States that are really good, men's shoes. In England makes really some fine shoes. Spain, Italy. You still got a lot of countries out there making some really great shoes. But they cost money. But those types of shoes you can rebuild many times over. I call them a lifetime shoe. I mean, you take care of them, they can last you a whole career, 20, 30 years. I mean, they're career shoes. So it's worth the money. You buy a cheap pair of shoes, they're made out of man-made material. Your feet sweat, you get problems with your feet, and you can't repair them. And you still pay $150, $200 for them. You throw them in the garbage can once a year or every 2 years. I mean, imagine if you bought a good pair of shoes, you could have bought a really good pair that'd last you a whole career for a few $100 more. And, once you wear a good pair of leather shoes, they're super comfortable. Guys come in here all the time and they just turn into shoe enthusiasts. They just can't stop buying good shoes. They come in with just lots and lots of them.
Do you have customers for whom you've repaired the same pair over and over again every couple of years? That you almost develop a relationship not just with the customer but with their shoe.
Yeah, we do a lot of those. I actually I like it that they're coming back, but I hate taking my work apart because we put it together so it doesn't come apart. So it's a little tough, but yeah, it's good. I always love seeing repeat business.
So let's go back to the history of the McFarland shop. This began around 1900 in Indiana, a small town in Indiana.
Yep. I just found out. I was always wondering who taught my grandfather because he opened his first shop around 1918 in Hamilton, Ohio. And a picture popped up on my Ancestry that had a new family portrait. And I don't always look at them because a lot of them are, different names and go way back. And I'm like, okay, I may actually know this person. So I look at the picture, and it's a guy in a shoe repair shop. And I'm like, holy cow, who is this? And I'm reading, and it's Jacob High. His last name is High, H-I-G-H. And that was my great-grandmother, was his sister. And I'm like, son of a gun. My grandmother, who died in her early 30s, married my grandfather when they were both like 15 and 16 years old. Well, Jacob High was her uncle. And my grandfather was one of 6, and his dad died when he was about 2 months shy of being born. So he lived a rough life. He was always getting in trouble. And I think, this is my own thinking, is when he married my grandmother, he probably knew he was a rough young man and said, you're not going to be running the streets, you're going to learn a trade, and taught him the trade. And I think that's what happened. I've actually called Jacob High's, some of his great-grandkids, talked to one of his great-grandsons and got some information from him, which was really, really, really interesting.
Talk about growing up in that environment?
I was very, very close to my dad. He was, when I lost him, it left a void that will never be filled in my heart. That's just never going to, be filled again. And when I'm in here working, I just, I grew up in the shop with him. So I still feel like I'm, he's still hanging around, And even though I know he's not here, I still just it feels like home. And so, to believe it or not, it's great when it's busy, but when it's not busy and it's quiet, sometimes I come in, I'm the only one here. It almost feels like if you're walking into a church or something, there's this real silent, you come in, it's just, you could hear a pin drop, and I just feel like this is a very special piece of ground for me. So, I don't know, it just feels very special.
You need a good pair of shoes to walk on that ground.
Yeah, that's true.
So I'm looking around at this equipment, and this is not computerized, digitized. Describe to me what I'm seeing with some of these things.
It's kind of it's not the oldest stuff, that's for sure. I used to have the old stuff. I mean, it went back to the 1930s. I do have one machine back here that's the oldest one's like 1962.
But there's no plastic. This is all.
Yeah, it's all cast iron, steel, sanding belts.
So talk to me about what I'm saying. So these are grinders, these are sanders, these will take care of edges and stuff. Talk to me about some of, like, back here. What am I looking at?
These are sewing machines that stitch the soles back on the bottoms. That's probably the hardest part of learning the trade is getting your stitching in, because it's got to look nice. You can really botch up a nice job if you're not good at sewing. Yeah.
When you were growing up in your father's shop, did you know that you were going to take over one day, that you were going to do this?
It's kind of like when you grow up and you learn to speak your native language. It's just, when did you learn to speak English? You don't remember. I was doing shoes my whole life, and I figured, I went to college for a couple years, but I knew this is where I was going to be. And I was. And I ended up going back to school to become what they call a podorthist, which is actually a real thing. And you get licensed to work with feet, diabetic shoes, making custom insoles. So I went back to school to do that. And the passing rate on that test was less than 40% first-time passing rate, and I was not a good tester, but I studied my butt off when I finished school for that. I had to learn all the anatomy, all the bones, and that was a lot to learn, just about a foot, So I realized, I had the capability to do something else if I didn't want to do this. But you know what? This is my life, so I like being here.
Are you in a place where you can, outside of the shop, just throughout your regular day, walk around and notice what people have on their feet, say to yourself, that shoe's in bad shape? That's going to affect their posture. That's going to affect their back, something like that. Is it something that becomes sort of subconsciously all-consuming?
Yeah, you would be surprised. That's one thing I do is I'll sit somewhere and I'll watch people, how they walk. It's one thing I learned when I went to orthopedic school. You watch the walk, they call the gait. And some pronate in, which means they're turning in, or they're rolling out, they're supinating. And when they wear the edges of the soles and heels a certain way, it makes the problem worse. It's kind of like if you're walking on the edge of a mattress. It's kind of hard to keep your balance. So your brain's really having to work with your feet to keep balance, even though you don't realize all that's going on. But your brain is communicating with your feet to keep the best balance possible. So when your shoes are starting to wear over, I'll have people that come in and they're barely worn over and they'll say, I've got to have this replaced because it bothers my back.
So you can look at a worn pair of shoes and extrapolate how this person's walking, how it's affecting their physiology.
Yeah, I can even tell what kind of work they do usually. Not every pair, but a lot of them. I can tell if they're a person that drives a lot and gets in and out of their car because they wear the left shoe out first because it's the pivot foot. So they'll wear a hole right through the center of that sole on the left shoe. I can tell if they work in a restaurant, if they cut hair. I can tell if they keep a messy house because they'll have a lot of cat hair or dog hair inside their shoe. So, if there's a lot of cat hair and dog hair inside the shoe, that means there's a lot of hair all over the house.
You're like a crime scene investigator for shoes.
Could be. I could have been. That would be my calling if I left out of here. That's a great idea. When I retire from here, I'm going to go work for NCIS, and I'm going to always inspect the shoes, and I can tell what they did. Yeah.
That was producer Richard Copeland visiting McFarland's shoe repair shop in Lakeland. Tell us about your shoes. Do you have a particularly memorable, if not fashion-forward pair that you cherish? Maybe you had some disco platforms or a dated pair of Doc Martens that you just love. You can email us at engage@cfpublic.org, or you can send us a talkback on the free Central Florida Public Media app. In the menu, select Send a Talkback, record your question or feedback, hit send. That's all for this week's edition of Engage. We'll be back next week on Thursday at 3 o'clock. I'm Sharon Stone. Thank you for joining us. All Things Considered is coming up following NPR News.